Hi everyone, it's John Mitchell. In this video, we're going to go through the termination phase. We're still in the employment cycle. Remember, there's three phases in the employment cycle. We've been through the establishment phase, the maintenance phase, and now we're into the final phase, which is termination. And termination is when the employee leaves the organization. And it's really important that, during termination, that an employee is treated fairly and lawfully. Obviously, there's laws to follow, whether you can fire an employee and all those types of things. But, thinking back to earlier videos where we looked at ethics and social responsibility in human resource management, one of the issues there was, trying to be fair to employees during termination. Now, termination can be either voluntary, and that's where the employee obviously decides to leave themselves, or involuntary, and that's where the organization makes the decision to terminate the employee's employment. Now, there are four methods of termination that we're going to go through, so we'll just go through them one by one. First one is retirement, and that is where the employee decides to leave the workforce. So not just leave the organisation, but leave the workforce as a whole. That they can later on they can go back to work if they choose to, but retirement really is where they've made the decision to leave the workforce. It's important that the organisation helps the retiree in that transition and helps prepare themselves, because it's a major change in someone's life, all right? They've been working for maybe 30, 40, 50 years, and then all of a sudden, they're taken out of the workforce, and it's a major transition in someone's life. So they need to prepare them for that. As well, the organisation needs to prepare themselves, because if they have, a number of people, near retirement age, they need to prepare themselves, because that could be lots of experience leaving the organisation. Now, first of all, entitlements, because in the study design, it talks about entitlements and transition issues. So the entitlements, the employee during their working life, are entitled to 9.5% minimum superannuation during their time of work. They may be entitled to a pension. Once they retire, they can access their superannuation. Transition issues, as I said, it's a major shift, a major transition in someone's life. So it's important that it's handled sensitively with by the organisation, and it should be handled as a major change, and recognised. So for the retiree, it could be things like giving them counselling, investment advice services. What do they actually do with their superannuation? Do they take a lump sum? Do they take a pension? All those kind of questions, would come into account. What do they do with their money? Lifestyle counselling. So, possibly helping them transition into different activities, because if they've been working 8 hours a day, 5-6 days a week, all of a sudden that's taken away from them. They're going to have a lot of time on their hands to fill in. So it's a major change in their lifestyle, and some counselling could help with that transition. For the organisation, succession planning is really important. Remember, so when developing employees to take on greater responsibility for when someone is retiring is really important, and obviously recruitment, if you have to recruit a new employee into the organisation. Another method of termination is resignation, and that is where the employee voluntarily leaves the organisation. Now, a person may resign for a number of reasons. It could be, promotion in another organisation, better conditions at another organisation, change in lifestyle, change in career, boredom with their current job, any number of reasons. So it's important that the organisation conducts an exit interview to determine what those reasons are, because what can happen is, there could be a trend. If you've got, staff turnover is quite high and people are resigning, more than the organisation would like, it would be really good to find out what the reasons were, so that they might find a trend that, possibly it is that our conditions aren't as good as at other organisations. So, for whatever reason, it's important to conduct the exit interview to find out the exact reasons why employees are leaving. Now, notice has to be given to the employer from the employer who's deciding to resign. The amount of notice required is set out in the workplace agreement. We'll get into workplace agreements when we cover employee relations, but it's the contract that sets out their employment conditions. And succession planning, again, is really important during that transition, so that if someone resigns, especially if it's a senior position, have we got someone to step into that role, whether it be permanently or even for a short period of time while we find a suitable replacement. Redundancy, that occurs when the employee leaves the organisation because their job no longer exists. That could be the result of technology changes, a restructure, a merger, anything like that, where the organisation is saying, well, we don't actually need this position anymore, therefore you no longer have a job. Now, redundancy can be either voluntary or involuntary. And what that means is that voluntary, where we say, right, the jobs are no longer going to exist. We offer a number of employees. You can take voluntary redundancy if you want, and as a result, they get a package where they're paid out for their time of service. And then if there's any people left over, positions left over, when it could be involuntary redundancy, where people are then forced to leave the organisation, tapped on the shoulder virtually. So the entitlements, employees are entitled to a redundancy package, which is set out again in the workplace agreement, often pay based on how long they've been at the organisation. They're entitled to be given notice, so a period of notice in terms of when they need to leave the organisation, pay and benefits for work they've actually conducted, and they're also entitled to time off to attend interviews. The amount of time, again, is stipulated in the workplace agreement. Each workplace agreement has to have a redundancy section in it to stipulate what employees are entitled to. Transition issues, obviously counselling. Again, this is the employee's is losing their job through no direct fault of their own. Outplacement services to try and find other employment, career advice, training advice, financial advice, everything like that. So, trying to help, because it's not the employee's fault, trying to help them the best they can to find other employment. To give you an example, here's just a basic example. Fairfax has closed its major printing presses in Melbourne and Sydney over the last, sort of five years or so. Human resource planning identified a large reduction in the number of employees required. So 100, just an example here, these aren't the exact numbers, but 150 jobs are to be made redundant. So what they might do is firstly offer voluntary redundancy. And let's say, for example, 80 people take that up. So out of the 150 jobs made redundant, 80 people decide, yep, I was thinking of leaving anyway, or, for whatever reason, I'll take up that voluntary redundancy. That leaves 70 that still need to leave the organisation. They may try and redeploy some of the employees, so find in growing parts of the business, find jobs for them. So let's say they found then 20 are redeployed into other areas of the business that have been growing, and that leaves still with 50 who need to leave the organisation because their jobs no longer exist, and there, as a result, involuntary redundancy is now enforced, where people are tapped on the shoulder and told, sorry, you've got so much notice, and we'll obviously implement some conditions to try and help find other employment, but your job no longer exists here. And so that, hopefully that shows you the difference between voluntary redundancy and involuntary redundancy. Dismissal is when an employee is terminated due to unacceptable behaviour or performance. There's two main types of dismissal. Summary dismissal is when an employee commits a serious breach of their employment contract, and therefore they can be dismissed immediately. So, serious breaches such as theft, sexual harassment, serious breach of occupational health and safety standards. On notice dismissal is, less serious, I suppose, but when an employee is not performing satisfactorily and they're given notice, so maybe given a written warning, but then they need to be given an opportunity to improve their performance. And if that performance doesn't improve, then they can be dismissed. And entitlements, employee, when they're dismissed, are entitled to the pay and benefits for the work they have actually performed. And it's transition issues, again, sensitivity and confidentiality is also really important during times of dismissal. Now, unfair dismissal, you may hear of it, it's written into a lot of the textbooks, occurs when an employee has been dismissed for discriminatory reasons. So, for example, absence from work due to illness or injury, belonging or not belonging to a trade union, and then obviously, race, sex, religion, sexual preference, all those types of things you can't discriminate against. And if anyone's dismissed on any of those terms, then they can put in an unfair dismissal claim. And it's important that the human resource managers know the law and are trained on how to handle dismissals, because it can be a really messy part of an organisation if it's not handled well. Just to recap, on the termination phase, we've got retirement, which is obviously a voluntary method, resignation, another voluntary method, redundancy. A lot of organisations will use either voluntary or involuntary redundancy, and then dismissal is obviously an involuntary method where we've got summary dismissal and on notice dismissal. So that really finishes our whole employment cycle through the establishment, maintenance and termination phases. And for questions, activities and more on this topic, then come on over to Teaching Bubble.